22 years old when I came to prison.
I was 30 years old when I went to prison.
I was at the age of 19. I just turned 19.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I help life-sentenced men transition from institutionalized prison life back into society. Every one of our men has already served 25 to 45 years in prison. I serve on the board of the Corrections Transition Program at Everglades Correctional Institution in Miami, Florida. I teach these men life skills and how to speak, listen, and think. So when they get paroled, they become assets to their communities rather than liabilities of the state.
Welcome, Facebookers, YouTubers, Twitterers. I don't even know if that's a word. Men Going Home. This is a new show right here at Miami Community Newspapers with my good friend Chris Wolfe, who has been a member of the Corrections Transition Program at Everglades Correctional Facility, founded in 1997 by FIU professor Dr. Rebecca Sheeran. And Chris, welcome here to Miami Community Newspapers and this new show, Men Going Home.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. Yes,
good to see you. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about the program.
Sure.
And about, first, the program that you've been involved in for 8 years, 9 years now?
13 years
13.
now.
Oh, excuse me.
13
years you've been involved in there at Everglades Correctional Facility.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the transition program there and what's entailed.
Well, the Corrections Transition Program was actually created in 1997 by Dr. Regina Sheeran and Marta Villacorta. And it's really the consequence of a change to the penal system back in 1972 when a life sentence was changed to 25 years of mandatory incarceration, and then you could be considered for parole. So Marta Villacorta, who was a former warden at a woman's prison and then also a high-ranking state official with the corrections department, she came up with the idea. She had the foresight to know that in 25 years, these men were going to get out, and we needed to do something to prepare them for their release. You can't just walk a man to the front door after 30 years of incarceration and say, okay, you can go home, go.
Yeah. I mean, let's give some perspective on that. So prior to what year, I know now life is life, correct?
Correct. After 1995, when you're sentenced to life in prison, that means life. Life is life. But prior to that, if you were convicted of a crime prior to 1995, let's say first-degree murder or second-degree murder, a life sentence meant you would serve 25 years of mandatory incarceration, and then you could be considered for parole.
So these are men that went in prior to 1995.
Correct.
And now they're available, able to get paroled after 25 years.
Right. They're eligible for parole consideration. Doesn't mean they'll get paroled, but they're eligible for parole consideration. These men are transferred in from all over the state. There's currently 50 state correctional facilities, 50 prisons, 7 privately run prisons, but there's really 144 facilities throughout the state of Florida that houses currently 95,600 inmates.
Wow, it's a lot of people. It's a huge budget, I imagine, and quite a tax on the state of Florida, on the people of Florida.
It's tremendous. Last year, the state of Florida allocated $2.4 billion to the Florida Department of Corrections.
Jeez.
The Florida Department of Corrections is the largest state agency in the state of Florida with almost 25,000 employees. And it's the third largest corrections system in the United States.
So let's talk specifically about the Corrections Transition Program.
Okay.
So prisoners come from other facilities, and I guess they're chosen to come into this program. Is that how it works?
Correct. There are 3 parole commissioners in Tallahassee who are appointed by the governor. They serve 4-year terms, and they review the convicts' files. Remember now, there's only about 5,000 inmates throughout the state of Florida who are still eligible for parole. We have now a community control system where now you serve 85% of your term, and then you're released. But there's still only about 5,000 inmates or convicts who are still subjected to the old parole system. So what happens is these commissioners review files. They review the files and they decide which convicts from around the state, because of their salient good behavior, should be considered for parole. And then they are transferred into Everglades Correctional Institution.
Okay. And the program in general, what are some of the things that you do with these inmates to prepare them? You specifically, and just the program in general.
Well, as we said in the introduction of today's show, I help these men transition from institutionalized prison life back out into society by teaching them to speak, listen, and think. Because if we can help them with their communication skills, they can apply for jobs, they can maintain relationships, and they can also give back to the community by teaching at-risk youth not to make the same mistakes they've made over the years. That's what I do. I created the Voices of Time Gavel Club, which in essence is a Toastmasters club, which is mandatory for the men to attend. So we've got about 115 men who currently attend the meetings. All right. So that's what we do. And that's been in effect for 13 years. That has a big effect on their lives because these men are in prison and they're told what to do. They're treated like children when they don't do what they're told to do. And it destroys someone's self-confidence and self-esteem. So when you develop these skills to stand before an audience and effectively communicate your message or thought process effectively, it does tremendous to lift somebody's self-confidence and self-esteem. Now, on the other hand, Dr. Sheeran, she created the Corrections Transition Program in 1997, and we have FIU students who work with the men. We have volunteers from the community come in and speak to the men every week. The men actually teach courses to the other men on conflict resolution, computer skills, parole planning, etc.
What a typical person that participates in this program? You've been doing this for 13 years.
Correct.
So I guess you've seen some men that come in fresh into the program.
Oh,
what are they like, and where do you hope to get them over time?
Well, every man that comes into the program has already served a minimum of 25 years in prison. So a lot of the men, when they come to our program, they don't want to be there. They just want to do their time and get out. So they're being uprooted from wherever they are that they're comfortable and sent down to Miami at Everglades Correctional Institution. So they come in and they are pretty much all the same when they come in. I mean, some are easier than others, but where we want to get them is to a point where when they transition out, they're successful. Because when people ask us why we do what we do, we say we do it to keep our streets safe. Because if we can help these men transition successfully, they're not going to go back to crime. So we're helping keep the streets safe. Our goal is to help them become wage-earning, tax-paying citizens. And our recidivism rate is tremendous.
Yeah, how's that turned out? Have you been successful doing this?
The average recidivism rate across the state of Florida for all crimes is approximately 25% and has been for years. The recidivism rate in our program is less than 1%.
Wow.
Less than 1%. We've had over 450 men transition out successfully. We've only had one man commit a serious crime. We've had others recidivate because when you get out, you're subjected to random urinalysis. And sometimes they come back with dirty urine, with alcohol or marijuana or cocaine in their urine. We get an occasional shoplifting charge, but not much. But there's only been one serious crime. The recidivism rate is tremendous.
Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive. And obviously alleviates quite a burden on the taxpayers of the state of Florida.
Oh, correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because people don't realize it's only about $22,000 to $24,000 a year to incarcerate an individual. But it's much more expensive than that when you add in the health charges that go with that. Remember, the state of Florida allocates $2.4 billion a year to house these men and run the system. $1.7 billion a year is just to house the men and pay the guards. $500 million is used for health services.
Wow.
And for the elderly convicts, it's much worse because they're the ones who really incur the charges. An elderly convict is considered anybody over the age of 50 who's still in prison.
Okay.
And I've seen quadruple bypasses, and I've seen knee replacements and strokes and hospital stays. And the health services charge is an escalating charge because we have an aging prison population.
And the numbers you're giving us probably don't even reflect the amount it costs the public to, like, a guy's out on parole, he's got a parole officer, right? So there's a certain expense associated with these individuals once they get out of prison, just monitoring
well,
them,
the $1.7 billion used to run the prisons is also including the cost of overseeing 165,000 convicts who need supervision who are already out. And that includes the men on parole.
Okay. So Men Going Home, tell us about the show. I mean, obviously you've been there for 13 years. You've been close one-on-one with a lot of these people that have, committed pretty horrendous crimes.
Correct.
And so the stories must be very compelling, I imagine. Tell us a little bit about Men Going Home, about the show that will be here at Miami Community Newspapers. Tell us a little bit about the program and what we can expect to sort of listen to and see when we watch
Well, we hope to raise, public awareness of who these men are. These are society's throwaways. Once they get put in prison, their families stay in touch with them for a period of time. And frequently after a certain period of time, usually not very long, the phone calls stop, the mail stops, the visitation stops. So we have access to a segment of society that people know very little about. And what's interesting is that when you tell somebody that this man has been convicted of first-degree murder or second-degree murder, there's a fear element like, oh my God, Chris, do you feel safe when you go there? And I feel very safe. If anything ever happened to me out there, the men would circle around me and protect me. Most of these men are just like you and me, except they're wearing blue uniforms and they made a bad choice or a bad decision. None of these men are serial killers. The drug deal's gone bad, robbery's gone bad, and unfortunately somebody ended up killed. And we hope to bring their stories out so that people get a chance to know who these men are, what life in prison is really like, and what they're doing now on the outside.
Yeah, and maybe tell the story of how difficult it is once they get out of prison to make a life for themselves. I imagine if you're in prison 30, 40 years, I mean, you're coming out into a totally different world.
Correct. A life parolee is living behind the 8 ball. It's very difficult to get a job because when you fill out the job application, they ask you, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you have to say yes. And then they want to know what happened. And usually, in many cases, they won't hire you. Now, our guys do get jobs as roofers, landscapers, dishwashers. The one job that men seem to do very well at and make a fair income at is truck driving. And we've got a number of guys who are doing some truck driving as well.
Okay. Well, let's, I know you brought some of these stories on video, on tape here.
Correct.
With us. Some of these guys, we can hear them in their own voice, tell a little bit about their story. Why don't we go to a few of those clips here and then maybe you can elaborate on what they're saying. I think the first one is a gentleman by the name of Henderson. Can we go to that, Tommy, to that clip?
My name is Daniel Henderson. I was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. In my life at that time, it was all nothing but drugs. I was 22 years old when I came. I've been in prison 37 years. Nobody is all bad, nobody is all good. I had played chess with Ted Bundy. I worked as runaround on death row. If there's anybody that was all bad, it was Ted Bundy. The reason I say 7 different Ted Bundys is sometimes you'd go down to Ted's house and he'd be Fred. Sometimes you go down to Ted's house and he'd be Tom. And there's different voices, different body languages and all that. But he was an excellent chess player no matter who he was. Well, my first thoughts when I was sentenced to life in prison was I gave up a pretty redhead, I gave up my daughter, I gave up my home, my truck, my everything, and that I based my self-esteem on. So I just figured that everything was over with. I'd like to leave my footprint somewhere. I'd like to help some old folks because the old folks are the one that led the way and nobody's there for them. I want to take them fishing. After 37 years of incarceration, I actually know Daniel Henderson very well. What it's taught me about me is that I can do anything I put my mind to, and I can accomplish and achieve whatever I want.
Amazing story.
Yeah.
So this gentleman, Henderson's his last name.
Correct.
This gentleman, he was friends with Ted Bundy.
He wasn't necessarily friends with Ted Bundy. He was at Florida State Prison when Ted Bundy was on death row. And because Daniel was a life sentence man, he was what's called a runaround on death row, meaning he would deliver breakfast, lunch, and dinner to the men on death row, and he would deliver mail. And what he would tell me is that he would frequently play chess with Ted Bundy and smoke pot with Ted Bundy as well. And when he said nobody's all good or all bad, he was referring to something that I used to say to the men all the time, to make them not feel as bad as they could and sometimes do for some of the things they've done. I used to tell them that nobody is all bad or all good. And I would repeat that to the men all the time. So what he was saying is Dr. Wolfe always says nobody's all bad or all good. He never met Ted Bundy. Right. But, Daniel's a tragic story because I have pictures of him at home that he gave me where he's opening Christmas presents under the tree when he was 10 years old, or where he's playing Little League football. And then he went into the military and he came back. And when he came back, he started selling marijuana in pretty big amounts. And what he would do is he would drive his vehicle from Central Florida through El Paso, Texas, into Juarez, Mexico. And he would load his vehicle up with marijuana, bring it back to Central Florida, and then he would sell it to people he knew in Central Florida and Southern Georgia. And his rule of thumb was always, I don't sell to anybody I don't know. But what happened was he let his guard down one day, and his two business partners had made an arrangement to sell a fair amount of marijuana to some guys he didn't know. And what happened was these other men showed up to buy the marijuana. And a minute or two after they got out of their vehicles, Daniel said they were wearing long coats. And they said, you know what time it is? And they reached into their coats and said, it's time for you to hand over the weed. And they pulled out guns. The two business partners of Henderson didn't even think twice. They just pulled their guns out and opened fire. And they killed two of the three men. The third got away, called the police anonymously, and told them what happened, where it happened, and who was involved. So Daniel, within 2 days, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And then what he did was he argued it was self-defense. He said, look, they were trying to kill us. And they said, well, that might be true, but when you're selling marijuana, felony murder takes place. So what happened was he ended up being convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder. They offered him 20 years, and he told him to kiss off in so many words. And he didn't take the deal. He should have, because Daniel ended up doing 41 years in prison, and they only let him out because he had terminal cancer. And he died within 30 days after they let him out.
Wow, what a tragic story.
And it's a shame because Daniel was a gentleman. He was a really nice guy.
And he served our country in the military, right?
And he himself never killed anybody. And the guys he was with who killed the other men, they actually pulled the triggers and killed the guys, and they got out after 20 or 25 years.
So they plead out and probably got a lesser sentence.
Correct. But the most human story that Daniel ever told me, because we used to go to the prison and we'd be waiting for class to start. So we would just talk one-on-one a lot with a lot of these men. And he told me the most human story I've ever heard from anybody. Because when he referred to the redhead, he was in love with the redhead. Right, he married her and he loved her. And he got 2 life sentences, and she would come to visit him month in and month out. And he finally told her, he said, listen, you got to move on with your life. I'm not getting out. And finally, after a couple of years, she showed up one day with his daughter, and she said, hey, Mom wants to talk to you. And she had to let Daniel know that she had moved on and she finally met somebody else. And I just thought how gut-wrenching that must have been to be in love with a woman, tell her she's got to move on with her life, and then she comes and says, I've done that. I've done that.
Did he ever see her again? Do you know?
I don't know.
Wow, amazing story. And these are some of the stories that we're going to hear.
Correct, yeah.
During Men Going Home here on at Miami Community Newspapers.
That is correct.
some of these people we're going to see on the show. They'll be here live.
Correct.
Being interviewed by you during this program, correct?
Sure. There's a number of men who live right here in Miami-Dade County. And you don't know they're here. And I always say that's a tribute to the success of the Corrections Transition Program, that we have many men who were convicted of first, second-degree murder, spent 30 plus years, 40 years in prison. They're out living amongst us, and they blend right in.
Well, Tommy, let's go to the second clip that we have here. A gentleman by the name of Goodman.
Correct.
Who has been part of the program and was part of this documentary, I guess you guys filmed. These are clips from that documentary.
We had filmed years ago. We had a speech contest at the prison, and these were all men who agreed to be interviewed with me prior to the competition. And they all actually competed in a speech contest.
Oh, that's awesome. So let's go to the second clip. It's a gentleman by the name of
My name's David Goodman. I was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree felony murder. And I fell in with a group that imported 20 tons of marijuana from South America in January of 1977. I was 30 years old when I went to prison. I came from a very good family and was in a very good family. I spent about 3.5 years on death row. For someone who had never been incarcerated, to be locked in 24 hours a day, basically, it was very hard. I didn't notice the hardship of being there as much as I did the loss of all that I had gave up by my choice. I will be 68 years old if I am paroled when I go up again. I wish to be with my family, have a garden, and be involved in everything that I can with the church.
There you go. Wow, that's he looked familiar. In the first clip that we saw, the intro, there was a photo of a gentleman, looked like maybe 30 or 40 years ago.
Correct.
With a young family. Was that him?
That was
looks
him.
like the same
That
person.
was him. I also have a picture of those same young girls hugging him when he walked out of the prison doors a few years ago.
Okay, so he's been released. He's back with that family? Is he still back with the same?
Well, he's in touch with his family, yes. He's very close with his family, yes.
And he lives here in South Florida?
No, he lives north of Tampa, somewhere between Tampa and Tallahassee. You know, when I hear David's story, I'm reminded of something that I see over and over again out at the prison. We are all just one bad decision from incarceration. And I tell people that all the time. We are all just one bad decision from incarceration. Because what he did, his story was that he was, like he said, he was 30 years old and he had a wife, lovely family, supportive parents, very religious family. And what happened was he was studying to get his master's degree at Florida State. He hurt his back and he couldn't do his regular job. So he started making some additional money selling marijuana. As he said, a few ounces, then a few pounds, then a few more pounds. And he said, Chris, my ship came in because he was brought in to help 17 other people unload 22 tons of marijuana off a ship that was coming up from South America. It was right off the Panhandle back in 1977. But what happened was 3 people who weren't supposed to be there while they were unloading and loading this marijuana came by. And the person in charge of that operation ordered that they be tied up and taken away, and that he was told they would be let go after the operation was finished. Unfortunately, they weren't. They were taken to Georgia and they were killed. David had nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. But there was an FBI informant involved with the 17 people, and everybody was cutting deals with the prosecution. And when the music stopped, David was still standing. He got 3 first-degree murder charges, felony murder, even though he didn't do the killing, and he spent 4 years on death row.
Wow. And was he there when these 2 people were killed?
No, he wasn't even there. They were driven off to Georgia. He was in Florida. They were driven to Georgia and killed. He wasn't even there. So what happened 4 years later was his attorneys, the conviction was lowered to life in prison. And he was
but you just said he spent 4 years on death row.
4 years on death row.
And he really never shot a gun at anyone.
No.
Knifed anyone.
No.
Really personally committed a murder. My perception has always been that you're on death row. You've killed people.
Correct.
gruesomely.
But that's
And-
not always the case.
Wow.
Right. So then what happened was he was more protected on death row than in the general population at Florida State. So his primary guard on death row said, "You want to stay here?" And he said, "I want to get away from death row. I just don't want to be here." And he could take care of himself. He's actually a lot older than he looks. He's well into his 70s at this point. And he stayed in prison for another 37 years, and he was paroled after 41 years.
Wow. How long was he in the program at Everglades?
He was in our program for probably 3, 4, 5 years, maybe at the most.
Is that about average? Is that typically when people come to or inmates come to your program, how long typically do they stay there?
They're usually there for at least, I would say, 2 to 5 years. Once in a while, somebody gets out rather quickly, but not too often. But I would say the average number of years it takes for one of our men to get paroled is 32 years in prison. Even though they're eligible at 25, they don't usually get out at 25. It's usually 31 to 32 before they get out, if they're going to get out.
Well, again, fascinating stories, men going home. You'll be able to see that right here in Miami Community Newspapers. Some compelling interviews. Let's talk about a couple more if we can.
Sure.
It looks like we've got some time here. A gentleman by the name of Larry Daniel.
Larry Daniel.
Now, Larry went through your program. He was with you for several years in the program.
He was there for a number of years, not too many, but probably 3 to 5.
And he's out now?
He is out. He's been out for several years. And Larry was an excellent speaker and a great leader. He was a real asset to the corrections transition program. He actually assumed the top leadership position in the program before he was paroled out.
And you remain in touch with guys like Larry and Henderson and Goodman?
Well, they're usually all Facebook friends.
Okay.
And I may see them periodically if I attend an event at the prison, but there hasn't been anything at the prison lately because of the coronavirus. I emceed an event in Tallahassee a few years back when we had juvenile offenders come out and talk to students about being a juvenile offender and getting a life sentence when you're 15, 16, 17 years old.
Are those type of events, do you find them effective?
Well, they can be. These were all criminal justice students.
Okay.
And they were attending this event. So it's good that they hear from actual men who have served time in prison so it gives them a lot of credibility on their subject.
Well, the next one, Larry Daniel, as I mentioned, Tommy, if you can, let's listen to Larry's story, a little bit of Larry's story, and then Chris, you can elaborate on that.
Sure.
My name is Larry Daniel. In 1985, I was convicted of the offense of first-degree murder. At that time in my life, when I was convicted of first-degree murder, I was going through some personal problems, and I got involved with some drug dealers, and the drug deal went bad, and unfortunately, one human being lost his life. I was 29 years old when I came to prison. My survival in prison the last 27 years, I would attribute to support by family, friends, and some of the administration within the Department of Correction giving you words of encouragement, telling you to keep going and keep doing what you're doing and stay on the path. Being a black belt in karate has helped me in keeping my concentration and my focus. When the judge sentenced me, imposed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum mandatory 25 years, I did not really understand just exactly what that meant. That was probably one of the most traumatic experiences I've ever had in my life. Upon my release from prison, I would like to be able to give back some of the consideration and faith and investment that have been placed in me as an inmate within the Department of Corrections. Somebody believed in me, and some people have believed in me to invest education and resources into my well-being. America is the land of second chances, and I intend to live in that land.
Wow, he got very, very emotional there. And a whole lot going on there. First off, the one thing that sort of resonates with me is it seems like there's a recurring theme going on with these clips that we're seeing today. And that is that it all started with just their involvement in drugs.
Yeah, that had a lot to do with it. We made a videotape for the National Marijuana Initiative a few years ago, and interviewed a lot of adolescents who got life sentences, and we found some common denominators. And that was that most of them will all tell you, especially the ones that came to prison when they were 16, 17, 18. The common denominators were that they hung around the wrong group of kids growing up. They used alcohol and drugs at very young ages, 11, 12, 13. They succumbed to peer pressure, and they just flat out made bad choices and bad decisions.
What about family, their family background? Some of these guys, a couple of them, or the one gentleman, I think it was Goodman, was talking about coming from a good family.
Correct.
But is that usually the case, or do you find that they're coming from families, maybe one-parent families, or families maybe where parents are on alcohol or drugs, or does that seem to be a common theme?
I don't mean to be evasive. It's all across the board.
Okay.
On that. There's lots of guys who had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters who never got into any trouble at all, wonderful parents, and they just, did things they shouldn't have done. So there's a misconception sometimes that so many of these guys come from one-parent households. That's not always true. A lot of these guys just make bad choices and bad decisions.
Yeah, and their stories will be really elaborated when you have them either live here on this set or through a Zoom link during your program, Men Going Home, here at Miami Community Newspapers. He mentions karate. That was interesting to me.
Yeah, it was my understanding that he was very involved with karate at a young age, and at one point he was actually trying to go to the Olympics for karate, and I think he was doing the qualifiers, and then for some reason, I believe, as he was saying diplomatically, that it was at a bad time in his life. I think he needed money, and he made a bad choice and a bad decision to get involved with drugs.
And like you say, it only takes one bad decision.
We see that over and over and over again.
That's the recurring theme with all these stories, pretty much.
Yeah, we won't see it today, but we'll see it probably in the future. I've got a guy named Dennis, and we asked him what happened. He's got a first-degree murder conviction. I said, what happened? He said, well, I went to a bar, I drank too much, a fight broke out, shots were fired, and somebody was killed. And he did 32 years for that.
Wrong place at the wrong time. It seemed to me with Larry Daniel that one thing that maybe has uplifted him is the confidence that he's getting from people like you. And I got to tell you, I've told you this before, my old college roommate here, Chris Wolfe, very proud of you. But do you think that that's sort of what some of these guys need? They just need someone to say, hey, you can do it. You can transition properly. You can be productive in society. Give them the confidence that they need.
Absolutely. And that's why the Voices of Time Gavel Club has been very helpful for these men, because it gives them a lot of confidence and self-esteem, because they do what most people fear. All of the men in our program are, believe it or not, great speakers. Every one of them can stand up and tell jokes and tell stories and entertain a crowd. And that gives people tremendous self-esteem and self-confidence. Yeah. And we don't put them down. Prison is a very negative place. They're told what to do. They're told when to stand up and when to sit down and when to, go to bed. And if they don't do what they're told, they're treated like children. And it's not a place that stimulates a lot of confidence or self-esteem.
So this more empowers them to go beyond being told when to stand and when to sit.
Correct. Well, and Larry in particular, he does a lot of speaking with at-risk youth. And because of his black belt experience, he lays down on a bed of nails and somebody puts a cement block on his stomach. And
really?
He's wonderful with children. And he really has taken it to heart when Dr. Sheeran told him, you got to give back to society and help other people not make the same mistakes you've made.
Well, we have time for one more of these clips.
Great.
And I'd love to see it. A gentleman by the name of Ojeda,
correct,
who's from down here, as you explained to me prior to coming on here at Miami Community News, explained to me he grew up right in this area in Westchester.
I believe he grew up in the Westchester area of Miami.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's hear what Ojeda has to say, and then you can elaborate a little bit on his story.
My name is Alberto Ojeda. I was originally convicted for first-degree murder. I got involved with a lot of drug smugglers, and it came to a point that one of the guys that I knew stole something from these people, and I had to be responsible for it. I had to be accountable for that person. And it led to this unfortunate situation where we got into altercation and one life was lost. I just turned 19, just a very young age. I didn't have too much knowledge. I didn't have responsibility that actually took and valued life at that time. I have been incarcerated now for 31 years. I didn't have value in life. All I wanted was, everything was for me, me and me. I have spent 31 years of life in prison. I want to go back out, and the rest of the time I have, I want to dedicate it to the youth. Not just to the youth, but to the older people, their grandparents, their fathers, their mothers and grandmothers. They have struggled all their life to give us a life to live for, to give us a better world to be in. And we steadily keep destroying it because the future is our young people. If we don't give them some kind of light, give them some kind of hope, there is going to be no future. Life is just going to die off.
You know, what resonates with me when I hear him and see him is he looks like guys I went to high school with.
Correct.
You know, and I graduated from high school here in Miami in 1978. And there's guys from my high school senior year, the senior year before me, 77, 79, 80, who ended up kind of just like him, who got involved in the wrong crowd, found it was maybe easy to make money. They were very self-centered. It was about making money for themselves, got involved in the drug trade, and some of them spent lots of years in prison. And it's surprising. I had just a quick story. I had a friend that came to town for his high school reunion, and he was a year behind me, graduated in 78 from my high school. And he said, you know, I'm going to meet a few guys at Mary Brickell Village to have a drink at happy hour. Come with me. And it was guys from his class, so I went. And one guy in particular, I won't mention names, I had no idea, had spent 11 or 12 years in prison. Wow. On a cocaine offense and got involved in the wrong crowd, wanted to make fast money. Was that the case with Ojeda, one of those types of deals?
Yeah, what happened with him is that, well, to expand on what you just said, you know, every Thursday night, you know, I'm in a classroom with 30 or 40 guys and I'm looking across. And the only difference between looking at them and any room full of people at a restaurant, just the blue uniforms. These guys are just like any one of us. It's just, it is remarkable. But what he said in there was that he was recruited by drug dealers. And what happened was he was 18 years old and he was recruited by people, I'm making an assumption here, probably wearing Rolex watches and driving Mercedes and had lots of money to spend. And they recruited them to sell cocaine. So what he said was these two South American men recruited him to sell cocaine, and he got into that whole crowd that used to hang out, if you remember, in Coconut Grove at the Mutiny and places like that, and Menage and all these places. But what happened to him was he brought somebody else in to sell for him, OJ. But what happened was the person he brought in took the cocaine, and nobody knew where he was. There was no cocaine. There was no money. And the people that OJ worked for said, you are personally responsible for this. So he contacted the man who he needed to see down in the Redlands area of Miami, which is about 232nd Street and Chrome Avenue. And whatever happened between them escalated. And the man who took the cocaine and wouldn't give the money that he went to see pulled a gun out. OJ had to defend himself, and a man was killed. And so I said to him, how long did it take them to apprehend you? He said, about 20 minutes. I said, what happened? He said, well, somebody heard a shot. They saw a car drive off to Chrome Avenue. And the next thing I know, there was a helicopter above us in about 20 minutes, followed us to the Bird Bowl on Bird Road, and we were apprehended. But he's just the nicest guy. He was also one of our leaders in the program, just a very reasonable, nice guy who got himself in a bad situation. And we're all just one bad decision from incarceration. Yeah,
and we're not trying to, you know, minimize the crimes they committed.
Correct.
I mean, they committed crimes. Do they minimize them, or do they are they accountable? Most of these guys.
No, they have to be accountable, or they won't get paroled. Right? Absolutely. They.
But is it a genuine thing? I mean, do you feel like these guys really believe that hey, what I did was wrong and I maybe deserve to be here for 20, 30, 40 years, whatever
The
it
vast
is.
majority, yes, absolutely. Most of the men, because remember, we all change. You know, you're not the same person you were when you were 15 or 17 that you are now.
Well, I don't know about that, but
But most of the men change,
Yes.
and they really, looking back at their lives now, they can't even believe they did the things they did. But they have come to
well,
terms
you know
with
what?
it.
Listen, Chris, much like, you know, you and I look at things we did when we were probably 18 or in college at the University of Florida. We
Right.
go, my God, I can't believe I did that back then. You know, so it's just their situation became a little more dramatic. It became a little more escalated, perhaps.
Right.
And certainly being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, we've all
Right.
done things that we probably look at in our life and say, you know, I could have ended up in jail driving, getting behind a wheel in that condition or whatever it might be.
You know, I know people today who are very respected in this community who tell me that when they were in their 20s, yeah, they were driving around the Southwest US selling marijuana, carrying guns. And, you know, the only difference between these men in prison and them is that nothing bad happened.
Right.
And
They
were
didn't get
lucky.
caught.
They were lucky. Right. They didn't get caught and they were lucky.
Right. Wow, it's really some compelling stories. I look forward to watching Men Going Home right here at Miami Community News. Any parting words about the show or anything you want to sort of enlighten us about Men Going Home in the program here at Miami Community News before we close?
Well, our first show will probably have a man on who spent 41 years in prison. He held up a mini mart when he was 17 years old and shot a man. But what's interesting about his story was his life of crime, because when he was 14 years old, he had already he masterminded 2 mini mart robberies himself and had quite a life of crime as a teenager. And then he went to prison on a murder charge.
This is a gentleman you brought to my radio show.
We did a radio show with
Right.
him at one time, and we talked to him about one specific crime, but we'll talk much more about his life and his family and what he's doing now, because he's turned his life around and he's doing very well now.
So Men Going Home will really get in depth on these men. It'll be very raw.
Yes.
Probably very compelling programming and something that you people who are frequently coming on to Facebook or YouTube right here at Miami Community News will be able to experience firsthand. Any other parting words, my friend?
No, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to work with you, and I look forward to Men Going Home in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned remarkable, the word remarkable. It's remarkable to me that the amount of money we spend in the state of Florida incarcerating individuals. I'm not saying we shouldn't incarcerate people. Certainly there's some people in jail that probably should never get out, right?
Well, another aspect that we'll talk about is adolescents getting life sentences, because that's something that they should make some adjustments on that, because what's happening today in the state of Florida is that an adolescent who commits a crime gets the same sentence as a 40 or 50-year-old man, yet adolescents don't reach full maturity until the age somewhere between 18 and 28, yet we're holding them fully accountable, and there has to be some adjustment for that.
Well, that and all sorts of issues that go along with this. You know, we've seen in America this summer, racial injustice and what's happening in the streets. You know, I say there's we have a criminal justice system that really needs to be overhauled in America and taken a look at not just what happens with policing on the street, but all the way to who we're sending to prison and for how long and at what age and all these sorts of issues. And these are the things that are going to be discussed and, festered, if you could, into or delved into, I should say, on your show, Men Going Home, here on Miami Community News.
Absolutely.
Chris Wolfe, thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for all you do for us here in South Florida.
Well,
hey,
thank
man,
you.
you're keeping the streets safe, right?
That's correct.
Well, thank you. Thank you,
Andy.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for watching today on Miami Community News. Stay with us, and you're going to see some great shows, Men Going Home. You won't want to miss them right here on Miami Community News. Thanks so much, and have a happy Thanksgiving.